Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming that at this moment I am live. I'm going to wave to all. Hopefully, someone in the chat will confirm with me that I'm live and you can see my screen and we can go and get started. Good morning, everyone on the chat. Good morning, Sarah, everyone on there who's sending me questions, or as you're chatting, sending me questions. I'm going to try to answer them. And also, I might ask you questions as we're going, be a little bit interactive. All right, so thanks for joining. Today we're going to talk about world building and then the cultural impacts of combat systems, especially in speculative fiction. So you might think from this title screen that we're going to talk about fighting games, and we're not. We're just going to talk about it on this one slide. But this is, if you know anything about Street Fighter, the things that we learn and talk about today are going to be applicable across a variety of mediums, including but not limited to video games like Street Fighter. So I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer here, just so we're aware. So this presentation is fundamentally about combat systems and organized, socially acceptable forms of violence, which is fundamentally about violence. I don't know if that makes you uncomfortable, but I'm not going to show any pictures or videos of any real injuries or any real violence occurring. I'm not going to do that in my presentation. I'm not going to discuss the relative effectiveness of different combat systems. That's not in the scope of what we're discussing here. But I will be discussing things like we'll talk a little bit about maybe MMA, mixed martial arts. We'll talk about bullfighting a little bit, things like that. Again, not going to show any pictures or things or that aspect. We're going to focus on what that means from a cultural aspect. All right. So violence, big, huge, massive category here. And when I was thinking about this presentation and how to bound it, I was like, well, I can't just talk about all kinds of violence. There's just too much. So I think it's helpful to think about like what types of violence there are and then what ramifications there are for these types. So first off, there is legal violence and illegal violence. That's pretty easy to understand. Beyond that, you could have violence that's organized or violence that is unorganized or disorganized, however you want to say that. And on top of that, you can have violence that is socially acceptable versus not. And so at this point, you might be like, well, Molly, give me some examples. If you talk about organized legal forms of socially acceptable violence, here we're starting to talk about combat sports. I know one of my pictures in here is American football, but which is not a combat sport, but it is certainly an organized, socially acceptable form of violence. There's tackling, people get hurt, all that kind of stuff. We also have in here, I think, it's probably either Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or judo. I'm a practitioner of judo. Fencing, sumo wrestling, all sorts of sports and combat sports would go into that area. I put MMA on the border here. We're going to talk a little bit about it. Depending on who you are, where you are, what society and culture you're part of, it might or might not be socially acceptable. I know that when I started judo, over 12 years ago, judo is not mixed martial arts, but it was very controversial for some people in my family that I was doing that. You always find out interesting things on whether something is socially acceptable or not, and is when you start doing it and what your family thinks about it. On the other side of unorganized but socially acceptable, debatably, hockey. So not hockey itself, but fighting in hockey. Technically, it's against the rules, but it is considered part of the sport. So kind of depending on who you ask, is it socially acceptable? Maybe yes, but maybe no. They're starting to crack down on it. Maybe that will change. Legal forms of maybe violence that are not socially acceptable, bullying, for example. Obviously, if bullying turns into assault, that is illegal, but not all bullying is illegal. It could be verbal violence, all sorts of things, which obviously is or should not be socially acceptable. Organized violence, we know what that is. You can have socially acceptable illegal forms of violence as well. Historically, honor dueling, if you've ever watched Hamilton, that's something that in many times and places in the world it was illegal, but people did it anyway. It was very common, quote unquote, common to do it. So you can have violence that's technically illegal but socially acceptable. Or if anyone has seen the show Brooklyn Nine-Nine, this is an instance where the character on the right is about to punch the character on the left, which is obviously, again, assault, which is illegal. It's not a planned out thing. It's not organized. And despite that, it is seen as a socially acceptable thing because he punches the guy. How should I say this? The show frames it that he punches the guy for the right reason, whatever that means to you. An interesting thing here when you start looking at this is I like to call this quadrant, it's not really a quadrant, this area here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this this disorganized, socially acceptable, illegal little square here, little rectangle here. I like to call that the boys will be boys area. And the reason I say this is if you're familiar with the term boys will be boys, whenever anyone says that term, what they say, what they're meaning is that violence that is illegal, unorganized, whatever violence they're saying it about, in their worldview, that violence that occurred is socially acceptable. For whatever reason, and that's the, like I said, that's the boys will be boys rectangle, is they're trying to convince you when they say that they are telling you about their worldview, and their worldview is that whatever violence just occurred is socially acceptable. So for our presentation, we're going to talk about socially acceptable, organized forms of combat. So this kind of, which is mostly combat sports, mostly combat sports. All right, it's important to understand that all societies accept some level of violence. All of them do. But the context and nature of the violence that they accept can provide you with cultural insight. So let's take a real world example. We're going to talk about bullfighting in Spain. So Spanish bullfighting, if you don't know, there are a couple different forms of bullfighting, but Spanish bullfighting in particular is the ritualistic killing of a bull for entertainment purposes. That's what it is. So, oops, we're gonna jump ahead. Did not mean to do that. So on the left, you can see one of the arenas. It's a Torre de Plazo. So I used to live in Valencia for a little bit. So that was the big arena there. So a little bit why this is interesting and why this is controversial. Obviously, the sport itself is controversial. But if we look at the second picture of this map, Spain is broken out into different kind of what we would call states. And you can see each one of these different states. So in the 1990s, the Canary Islands banned bullfighting, just outright banned it. And for many years, that was how they operated. You can see Galicia, which is in the upper left, has that light red color. They let individual cities ban bullfighting as well. But then in 2012, Catalonia, which is this pink color over here, they decided to ban bullfighting. And when they decided to ban bullfighting, a year later, 2013, the National Parliament of Spain, they passed a law stating that bullfighting was an indisputable part of Spanish cultural heritage. And therefore, like was an indisputable part and had to be saved. So in 2016, their federal court went and told basically Catalonia, Galicia, the Canary Islands that they could not ban something that was essentially a national sport. They weren't allowed to do it, and the ban was overturned. Later on, a different city tried to also ban the killing of bulls. They were also overturned. The interesting thing, what this tells us about Spain is this is my question for the chat. Um, what do you think this tells us about Spain? Do you know anything about Spanish history? And and what kind of this the interesting part here is the Canary Islands did it for years, for almost over 20, I think it was almost 20 years, they had banned bullfighting, and essentially no one in main Spain cared. So I'm going to I see a couple people are typing, and maybe you don't know the history of Spain, you don't know what the cultural situation is there, which is fine. But if you have any stabs at what this might say, lovely to hear them. To give you also a little bit of thought on this is that third picture, which is the percentage of people who don't actually consider themselves Spanish. They consider themselves their identity tied to the region, the sub-region they live in. Jennifer Wynn said, I think it tells us a lot about how Spain doesn't want Catalonia making decisions. Yeah. So Catalonia is actually, as people are thinking about this, they have repeatedly tried to become their own country and make their own decisions. They want independence in many ways. They don't, many of them, obviously, this is on a scale for that third map, is on a scale from 0 to almost 25%. Many of them don't even consider themselves Spanish. They have their own language. It's a separate language, Catalonian. They have their own culture, their own all this kind of stuff, and they many again want their own country. There's a huge history dating back a long time on that. I'm not going to quite get into it, but you see when you start cracking open the shell of, okay, well, I thought I was talking about bullfighting, but I'm actually talking about the independence potentially of a smaller sub-region of Spain, and it can get quite interesting when you start really looking at some of this stuff. And we've got some statistics on the right. They're all in Spanish, so you'll just have to trust me unless you speak Spanish like I do, which is basically the number of people going to bullfighting is actually decreasing over the years, and the number of people in Spain overall who think that bullfighting should be banned is actually quite high. Uh, it's important to remember, what we deem as socially acceptable can change over time. So this is a US example. Mixed martial arts has really had an interesting evolution in the US. This was a 2013 map. It's now more or less legal, I believe legal, but not necessarily regulated in every state. Don't quote me on that one. I'd have to look up the current state. State meaning state of affairs, not state in terms of territories. The New York was the last one to go and legalize MMA, and they did that in 2016. And even when they did it, it was pretty popular at the time. But we still had Congress people from the state of New York saying that it was atrocious, it shouldn't be done, comparing it to yeah, there was a lot of comparisons. You can look up quotes and read them. Excuse me. Uh, but it's still a controversial thing for many people. For many people, not. It draws in a lot of money. They go to it. They like watching it. It depends on where you are, who you are, what your background is, whether this is a socially acceptable thing or not. And yeah, there if you want an interesting look at this, there's been some YouTube kind of breakdowns that talk about the state of especially New York, how it went from legal to almost overnight illegal, and then they had to fight for years and years to make it legal again. It's an interesting thing. It involves, politicians like Rudy Giuliani. It involves John McCain. It involves just this crazy story across over a decade. It's very, very interesting. All right, so we have violence. We have socially acceptable forms of violence in the real world, but how do you get there? How do you become socially acceptable? And I'm showing, maybe I was the only person who ever watched this show. I'm not sure. Ping me in the Discord if you've watched it. I figure that when you're when your violence becomes a kid's show on a popular network, it's probably socially acceptable at that time. So the first part about how does a combat system become socially acceptable? The first aspect is combat systems have a history and they have some sort of purpose. So somebody at some point in time thought that their combat system was the best for their resources and the environment that they were operating in. Oh, Allison said she grew up with that show. Virtual high five, Allison. All right, so like I said, somebody at some point thought that their combat system, whatever they came up with, was the best for their resources and the environment that they had access to. So on the upper left, we have a man. His name is Jigoro Kano. He is the founder of judo, and basically the inception for judo was sort of twofold. One being at that time in Japan, there were a lot of disparate jiu-jitsu places that were teaching all their own different things. And he wanted to study a bunch of them and then learn like what was the most efficient way of doing things. And his other impetus for creating judo was actually that he was an educator. He was very passionate about education. That was his primary job, was an educator. And he wanted a martial art that students could practice in school and they could practice with full speed and control and force, but not injure each other. And that's how judo came to be. We also have Wing Chun, which is a Chinese martial art. Legend has it there is that there was a martial art instructor, and she was, or sorry, not she. They were watching a fight between a stork and either a rodent or a snake. The stories kind of differ, and based on how the stork was able to defend itself, that person then based the martial art after these movements, and eventually actually taught it to one of their students who used it to defend herself against an unwanted suitor. So that's kind of the history or maybe more mythos of that one. And Taekwondo is on the bottom one. Taekwondo is often said that it was used by farmers or who didn't have weapons to unseat horsemen. So that's why you see like a lot of high level kicks is allegedly the initialization was again to unseat horsemen. Okay, so combat systems have a history, they have a purpose, they have a reason why they exist. They also, if you want your violence to be acceptable, it has rules. These rules could be very formal. Most sports, combat sports, and by most I mean all, have rule books. They have very specific rules. They have terms about what is legal and illegal in the sport, what techniques can and cannot be used, all sorts of those kinds of things. And you might have a series of informal rules. So those informal rules might be, if you're in a bar fight, you would consider certain techniques, even though it's not written down, certain people would consider different techniques to be not allowable, right? Does that make sense? The context matters. There's people who have ideas in their head about like what is allowable in a fight, even if there's not written down rules. And this is true for sports or combat sports where there are written rules. Again, going back to hockey, the written rules say no fighting. The written rules say no punching each other. But the informal rule is you can as long as both parties consent. And so it's interesting. You have formal, you have informal rules. You can have both operating at the same time. And sometimes, oftentimes, breaking the informal rules is seen as a worse act than breaking the formal rules. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Yeah, someone mentioned below the belt. Yeah, great example. So we have here some notorious rule breakers. I'm going to get a drink of water here. So, all right, if you're a notorious rule breaker, you're breaking the rules of your sport, what happens to you? Well, if you're Ndamukong Suh, you win a Super Bowl, essentially. And sure, people know that you're dirty and no one wants to play against you, and they say that. But it's very much a thing. We'll talk a little bit about tribalism and identity. It's very much a thing of, well, he's really good and we want him on our team. And it's in some ways, I'm going to say tolerated, especially if he's part of your team. You'll hear people say things like, well, at least he's playing for us. So you get him, go down to John Jones. So John Jones is an MMA fighter. He is unbelievably skilled. He's only ever lost one match. And in that match, there was actually a misunderstanding of the rules by the ref. So he either debating on who you talk to, he shouldn't have lost the match. Some people will say it should have been a no contest. Other people will say that he should have just won. And he cheats. Some of his cheating is borderline. It's informal, like he does these things called oblique kicks, which aren't technically illegal, but most people want them to be. He does eye pokes, but his defense for eye pokes is he like sticks his hand out and he's like, well, if I happen to walk forward with my hand out and they don't move and they happen to get poked in the eye, that's just their fault, which is not how that works. Um, but again, he kind of gets away with it because he's a huge draw. He makes a ton of money for those people. And again, he is tremendously good at what he does, and he's very popular because of that. I have a little quote, and it's from my husband, so that's exciting. But he went and said, I hate him, but he is magnificent to watch. Another example, we have, I always mess up saying his name, so forgive me. Josemar, I think his first name is Josemar because it's Portuguese and the R is an H. Josemar Pilares. He's not as popular in MMA. And he actually got banned from the sport. And he got banned from the sport for essentially for injuring other fighters. He would do submissions and then he would continue to do submissions even after the person tapped and even after the ref would try to be pulling him off people, which is yeah, beyond what is acceptable by far. There's no excuse for it. He actively hurts and damages people. You can look at what happened to Jake Shields' face, and again, for him, his ramifications were he got kicked out of the sport. And then we have another example, which is Lance Armstrong, and he is an interesting example of evolving informal rules, right? Because he was caught for juicing, for using performance enhancing drugs. And his, I guess, defense, but not defense, was that everyone was doing it. And not only was everyone doing it, but the only way to be competitive was to use performance enhancing drugs. And the rules had always had that this was illegal. It was always illegal in the rules. What changed was, as society, our ability to detect and then enforce those rules. And suddenly, an informal exception, right? The formal rules said don't do it. The informal rules said, well, everybody's doing it, so you should. And then suddenly, and not that suddenly, there was a shift. And it came from maybe acceptable slash, do it to unacceptable. And his legacy got tarnished as a result of those shifting, kind of rules about not rules, but norms about what was acceptable or not in his sport. All right, so those are people who chronically break the rules, let's say it, or operate on the edges of the rules, but also yeah, someone makes a great point. Yeah, the choice of how to enforce when people have enforcement of the rules, the severity of the punishments they face is really interesting and, something you could play with when you start world building. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but, who has the power? How good are they at what they do? Um, really impacts, unfortunately, really impacts how the rules get applied to them. I want to talk very, very briefly about the fact that violence can happen in sports beyond the scope of what you would expect, but very infrequently does it result in legal action. So you see, I'm not going to talk about the incident on there. I've you don't see what's it. This is after the incident has happened. But if you're familiar, you'll know what this is. There's been instances in sports where people fight, people, get into brawls, and not just like the hockey type of fight, but in other sports as well. People have spit on each other. People have done all these kinds of things, which obviously are not in the rules. That's not the norms to do. But very, very infrequently do you see any civil or criminal action taken against them. And I thought it's really interesting to try to see out to figure out why. So basically, the courts have kind of said that when someone agrees to play a sport, they are effectively consenting to the physical contact consistent with the understood rules of the game. So remember, the understood rules of the game includes both the formal and the informal rules. So, where is that boundary? Right? For many of these sports, where's no one really knows where that boundary is. Like clearly, I have the quote here. Clearly, if you're a boxer, you're going to get hit by a punch. But if you're a football player, are you expecting to get hit by a punch? Is that consistent with the understood norms of the game? In general, people say yes. There are occasionally times where people do get criminal action taken against them, and the majority of those times are assault with a deadly weapon. And it has happened. Uh, this is a just an interesting, evolving kind of legal thing that I thought was interesting. All right. So this leads, as we talked a little bit about bullfighting, right? The Spanish Parliament said that bullfighting was like ingrained in the society and part of Spanish culture. Well, for many of these combat systems, especially since they have these deep histories, they can become tied to a culture and even to the history of a nation. So on the bottom right, we have sumo wrestling. Sumo wrestling is the national sport of Japan. A little bit ironically, the top guy in sumo wrestling right now, you're seeing him here. His name is Hakuho. He's actually Mongolian, although he just got his Japanese citizenship. But when we let these combat sports and these things become part of our identity, like we start attaching our humans, we attach this part to our identity, tribalism can occur. And we see this all the time, especially with sports teams. I'm a big Viking fan, so, I can say this, the Packers are awful, right? Is that objectively true? No, right? But when we do tribalism, we think that our team is the best, our thing is the best, the other things are bad. They're the villains. And that can happen. It can really sometimes be blinding when your reality is not the same. Or sorry, let's say that a different way. When reality doesn't align with what your perceived reality, what your perceived worldview is. And this is my tie into that. The guy on the right is named his nickname is Mad Dog. He's an MMA fighter. I think his name is pronounced Zhu Zhaodong, but people can feel free to correct me. So basically, he is a Chinese martial artist, or sorry, MMA fighter, and he has made a name for himself basically fighting these martial art masters of martial arts. They think they are masters. Their students think that they are masters, and they're these experts at fighting. And he exposes them as kind of fakes. Um, in this one, I believe he's fighting a Tai Chi master, and this is a person who says that he can like direct the flow of your energy without touching you, and like no touch knockouts, things like that. And beats him quite quickly if you watch the video. But unfortunately for our Mad Dog here, that had some pretty serious and has pretty serious ramifications for him because how do I want to put this? There are certain people and a certain government who really is proud of some of their martial arts and was not happy when their martial arts that was tied to their identity were questioned. And so he has faced some pretty significant uh, detriments for doing these fights and for kind of quote unquote exposing these people as frauds or not as good as they think they are or not as good as they tell people that they are. Um, this is an interesting thing. Again, I recommend that you look this up on your own and kind of see the background of what has happened to him and how he has to deal with the ramification of something that, most of us thought was not a big deal, uh, but has become almost an international thing. So this is great. We've talked about combat systems and the acceptance of violence in the real world, but then how can we use media or how can media use these things to tell a story? So first, we're going to start with a couple examples that aren't speculative fiction. So there's no real need for world building, but combat and combat systems can still be used to inform the consumers of the media about the context of the world, our characters, and the value of the cultures that they hold and more. So everybody knows what we're going to talk about here. It's the quintessential movie for talking about this, and that's right, it's the movie Goon. All right. I think I am the only person who's actually seen this movie. Uh, I'm just responding to how to spell his name in the chat is I think I spelled it right there. So in this movie, if you've not seen it, because I don't think most people have, basically we have these two characters, and both of them are essentially the same in many ways. They're both what kind of in hockey is referred to as a goon. The guy on the right can barely skate as at the beginning of the movie. He is recruited onto a hockey team because he is good at beating people up in fights. And that's why they bring him onto the hockey team. And that's what he does. He just fights people for the hockey team. Both of them are doing that. Both of them are that player on their team. Both of them are breaking the formal rules of hockey. And so, what's the difference? How is one person the protagonist and one person is the antagonist when they're essentially the same person doing the same thing? And the difference here is that one of them, the guy on the left, he's the antagonist because he's breaking some of the informal rules. Uh, he is, they just portray him as there's a formal rule of like you don't fight someone when they don't consent to it. Fair. Or like he'll get people to want to fight and then he walks away. And it's like, oh, he's such a jerk. He's the antagonist. And then his motivation is he wants to preserve his legacy, which and then the other guy, the protagonist, is like, oh, he wants to protect his friends and he wants to protect his team and he's doing it for his, doing it for a higher purpose kind of thing. Is the framing that they put around this, which tells us something about at least what the creators of this movie thought were cultural values, right? Again, not really the greatest movie. Don't know that I recommend it, but interesting when you look at what does the combat tell us about the characters? What does the combat tell us about the world in which they live in? All right, but let's transition to speculative fiction worlds. Let's get out of the real world and start talking about the fun stuff. So, again, this example is one of my favorite movies, actually. and I might again be one of the only people who have seen it. In this case, I actually do recommend it. It's called The Boy and the Beast. There's a lot of interesting things combat-wise which happen in this movie and talk about the worldview and the world that these guys live in. But one which you can see in this picture is that their swords are actually tied shut. So they practice martial arts, they practice combat all the time, but uh, like I said, their swords are tied shut. They cannot be drawn. And of course, the quintessential, if you want to talk about using combat and combat systems for world building, we have to talk about The Last Airbender. I know I joked about talking about Rocky 4, which uh, is the quintessential example in terms of fiction, but not speculative fiction. But we have to talk about The Last Airbender because combat systems are like the crux of the story and the entire world building. It impacts how the characters move, how they think, what values they hold, how they see the world. It ties them to the very land that they live on. It has to, you know, it has to do with like where they live, where they come from, their histories. Um, it each bending has its own origin story, its own history. It's tied into like the magic of the world. It's tied into like the spirit world thing. It's their concept of even afterlife is tied into it. Everything. Their national, and then it gets into this nationalism and tribalism really comes in. You know, people think that they're better than others because their bending is the best bending, and everyone needs to, do their thing, and they need to rule the world. And again, like I mentioned, each one of the styles has its own rules, its own technique, its own structure to it. It has techniques that maybe are banned or not allowed. It has rules and structures like in the Fire Nation, they have Agni Kais, which are very structured. There are rules about how you do that. And it, again, encompasses you cannot have Avatar The Last Airbender without the combat systems. It wouldn't work. Not to mention all of the vast, rich world building that it brings to uh, this world. Someone's mentioning Rurouni Kenshin in the Discord, and that is a great example of how to use violence for characterizing an individual character. Another example we can talk about for world building is in the Star Wars universe. And we have the Jedi, we have the Sith, and it's the same thing. Like the Force is the same thing. It's how they use it, how they perceive it. And then a lot of people don't talk about it, but there's also kind of the gray Jedi uh, is kind of what they're referred to, who kind of say that what do you guys, their aspect is, what are you guys talking about? There's no inherent bad and good. There's just the Force, and it's just how you use it. You guys are being weird. Let's follow like kind of a balanced path here. And my thing that I think is really interesting about the Jedi is that like they cause their own problems sometimes because of their code. My example here is in the third movie. So I'm like actual like episode 3, right? And we have Anakin Skywalker and he's having these like nightmare dreams that this woman that he loves is going to die. And he goes to Yoda and he's like, I'm having these dreams that someone's going to die and it's someone I like. And Yoda's like, that's a bummer, but people die and Jedi shouldn't have any connections, so you should just accept that they're gonna die and then actually just be happy about it because they're gonna rejoin the Force and it's gonna be great. And in that moment, it's like, dude, you send him to a counselor. Like, that's not something you say like, well, too bad. Like they cause a lot of their own problems sometimes because their code and their worldview. And even though they see themselves as knights, they call themselves Jedi Knights. If you watch, the stuff, they do a lot of not nice things. They're not saints in this thing, but they see themselves through the lens that they're the knights. All right, so we've talked about real world. We've talked a little bit about then the context of media and media doing world building with combat. But now, how do you apply it? Like, you want to do this in your work. You want societally acceptable violence. You want to use it for world building for your fantasy, sci-fi, speculative fiction world. How do you go about doing that? Because I've told you a lot of things, but I'm really big on kind of like algorithms and, you know, clear things that you can do. And I think the first thing to do is if you have a combat system, great. Really think about like what is the background of it? It should have a background, it should have a reason for existing, and maybe a history. Start there. And right there you're going to start world building right when you start there. After you decide kind of the background, the reasoning for why your martial art or your combat system, whatever it is, why it exists, then decide, is practicing that violence legal? Is it socially acceptable? Those are not mutually exclusive things. As we've talked about, it could be legal but not acceptable. It could be acceptable but not legal. Think about what kind of rules exist to govern your combat system. Why those rules exist? Do they exist so you don't hurt other people? Do they exist for whatever reason they might exist? And then also think about what happens to rule breakers. Does different thing happen to rule breakers? Are all rule breakers treated the same? All that kind of stuff can really inform, because again, as we saw in the real world, what happens to rule breakers really depends on sometimes who they are and how much power they have. So maybe you want to say something about society in your fantasy world or your speculative fiction world about that and who has power and what they can or cannot get away with. So I've left a couple of minutes here for questions. I see some question or some activity in the Discord. So more or less, start pinging me here. I'll talk a little bit. My husband kind of poked me and made fun of me because he's like, you should have started by introducing yourself. And I was like, yeah, but I want to give people time to ask me questions, so I'll talk about myself then. My name is Molly. I go by MS Ewing in the writer world. I'm a writer, I'm a martial artist, I'm a podcaster. I'm on a podcast called Semi Sages of the Pages. We have a session later today. You might have seen other members of the podcast around. They're doing other panels, that kind of thing. And if you want to connect, you can find me on all sorts of places. Da, 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 da. Oh, someone makes an interesting point. Kira says these guidelines that I'm talking about feel like they could be applied to magical systems just as well. That's an interesting, really interesting idea that I had not thought about. Now you're going to make my gears turn in my head. Excuse me. Yeah, so I'm going to wait for a couple of questions. I see people typing. Oh, yeah, and that's me and my husband practicing judo in our garage. We got some mats. It was quarantine time, so you get to see our garage too. Excuse me. Yep, I still see. I have like 7 minutes. We don't have to use the 7 minutes, but I am still seeing a couple people typing, so I do want to wait just in case there are questions. Um, After a couple minutes, if nobody asks me a question, we'll log off, let the next presentation get started. I really appreciate everyone coming and joining and listening. It's exciting. I really like this topic, and I've been thinking about it for a long time, so I appreciate that other people were interested as well. Excuse me. Sloan makes a great point about manner systems. We have a question. Do you think readers could have the same patience for a detailed combat system as they would for a detailed magic system? I think yes. I think it depends on how you introduce the concept to the reader, which is the same with magic systems, right? There's a difference between info dumping. Or you could just throw them in the world, and they have to learn the rules as they go through the world. I think that, it's kind of proven there are combat systems out there that people do write about that are very popular. Um, for example, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Uh, we have Avatar: The Last Airbender, we have Jedi books, we have all these kinds of things. I think it really does depend on, accessibility, and sometimes, I don't know that people want to read about like really specific techniques. Uh, Probably not, but in terms of like violence, I mean, you have like assassin guilds. That's a really common theme, which is essentially a acceptable form of violence that is structured and then people join it. So I would think that yeah, people would be interested in that. Do, do, do. I have a question. How do you avoid making it feel like you are stealing something that really exists, since there are already so many variations in the real world? Yes. Yes. This is an interesting question. This is a really interesting question. I think that the best way to do it is you can I think that's a real danger if you try to steal something from the real world, right? If you're like, "Ooh, I think this martial art is really cool and I'm just going to like put it in my book." Or I think this technique from their sport is really cool and I'm just going to put it in my book. And I think that can have a real danger. I think if you come from the approach of, okay, why does I want a combat system in my world? What is my world? What's going on in my world? What are people experiencing in my world? And then how would combat evolve to deal with that, right? You're looking at the purpose on why combat is there, then that's going to inform you. Like if you have a combat system where there's no gravity, what does that look like? Right? What kind of techniques do people do if there's no gravity? That kicking probably wouldn't be a very, striking people probably wouldn't be a very effective thing, because if you kick them, you're gonna go away. You can't get much force. You can't do this or that. So like thinking about those kinds of things, and so that the purpose is clearly, it's not that you're stealing, it's that this makes sense in the context of your world. Because if you steal stuff that you're losing that context, and that's what makes it seem weird when you find it other places. Is it's like that it's contextless. Why is it existing? And this thing previously in the real world existed for a reason, and that reason doesn't make sense in your fantasy world. And you don't have to call it a martial art in your fantasy world. You could just say you don't have to call it a martial art. If that worries you, you can include weapons. Obviously, I didn't talk a lot about, the biathlon has rifle shooting in it. All this kinds of stuff. Do. There's a lot of questions now, and I feel bad because I'm not going to be able to get to them. Uh, Raquel says that there's a lot of good resources online about avoiding cultural appropriation, and that seems like a great idea. I might go onto the Discord after this and maybe engage with some of you guys, but I'm kind of at the end of my time. I want to make sure that the next panelist has enough time that they can get in and they can get situated for their next talk. So thank you all so very much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. I'm so glad that other people were interested about this topic as well. And I hope to see you all around at the con. Goodbye. Oh, I gotta stop sharing my screen and then I will say goodbye. Goodbye all.